Hello, and welcome to Seeing the World, Christian Worldview and Why It Matters. This is part 2 in a series looking at Christian worldview, Christian education, and what it means to us. My name is Shelley Vivian. I'm the curriculum coordinator for Rehoboth Christian College, and today we want to be thinking about the idea of how do I know if I have a Christian worldview? Let's think together about some of these ideas. Last time we said that a worldview came from the answers to the basic big questions of life, whether that was, who am I and how did I come to be here? What's gone wrong with the world and how do we fix it? How do I know what is true? Today we're also going to add to that with a definition of worldview that we've taken from Dr. Jeff Myers, the president of Summit Ministries. He says, a worldview is a pattern of ideas, beliefs, convictions, and habits that help make sense of God, the world, and our relationship to God. With that definition in mind, let's think about where we get our worldview from. For all of us, we will be influenced by a number of factors that will determine our worldview. At the beginning, we'll be influenced by our family, how our family thinks about how the world works, the practices that we employ, the decisions that we make in our families will help to impact the way that we look at the world, how we think about God, how we think that solutions should be drawn. In addition to that, our education will make a big impact on what we think. It will propose all kinds of ideas about this world. It will propose solutions to the problems of this life, and it will guide us in thinking about what's important in this world. Our culture also is going to help to form and mold our worldview. And the media around us in a large way will impact us, especially nowadays with the number of opportunities to read, to be on the internet, to see television and movies. All of these things will guide and direct our thinking. And our own experiences will lend credence to whether the world works a certain way or not. All of these things are factors in our own worldview, as well as the worldview of those around us. Let's just take one of those factors, media. Did you know that for every minute, about 204 million email messages are sent, about 48 hours of YouTube video are uploaded, 100,000 tweets will be sent out into the stratosphere, and 3,600 new Instagram stories will be shared. With all of this information at our fingertips, at just the click of a button, does it mean that we are gaining greater wisdom? Is there greater truth to be found as a result of all of this information that we have access to? And how is all of this information impacting ours, and let's face it, our children's worldview? The media has a definite worldview. All we have to do is take a quick look at some of the news headlines that are quick to explain how the problems of this world have been caused by Christians, and how even having a Christian worldview is so absurd as to be counted as ridiculous. It doesn't take very long before we might begin to feel a little bit ashamed of the fact that we're Christians, and we might begin to hide our Christian point of view. Even worse is that our worldview may not actually be quite as Christian as we imagine it is. Take a look at these statistics. The Barna Group is an organization that surveys Christians and looks at how well their worldview matches up to biblical principles. New spirituality is one of the biggest worldviews out there, and it has a number of ideas that sometimes Christians have adopted. When 1,500 Christians were surveyed about statements like these, many of them strongly agreed with them. Such statements as that all people pray to the same God or Spirit, no matter what name they might go by. 28% agreed with this statement. Or take a look that 27% agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that meaning and purpose come from becoming one with all that is, this idea of sort of a universal spirit. Or the commonly held belief that if you do good, you will receive good. If you do bad, you will receive bad. Many people think that this is a biblical value, when in fact, it does not come from a biblical worldview at all. What about our young people? How do they feel about statements such as this? George Barna also reports that 63% of Christian teenagers surveyed agreed that Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, Jews, and all others that pray to some kind of God are all praying to the same God, even though they might use a different name for them. That is of great concern, that our Christian young people are not able to see that this is not reflecting a Christian worldview. One thing that's important to understand is that the things that we say we believe, our statements of belief, are not necessarily the things that actually govern our behavior, what we might call our controlling beliefs. If I were to ask you how you thought the world worked, or what you believed from the Bible, you would probably be able to tell me some things that you think you believe. But when it comes to your actions, does it bear out? Are these the things that actually are controlling your decision making on a day-to-day basis? Here's a little example. A long time ago, my sister was dating a young man who would eventually become her husband, and he was eating breakfast with our family one morning when he announced his intention to go and get a second glass of orange juice. We all let out a collective gasp. A second glass of orange juice? Could you do that? Well, my future brother-in-law, who always likes to know why people do what they do, began to try to figure out why we were so shocked by this concept. Turns out, when we were young, we had an orange tree in our backyard, and every morning my father would go out, pick some oranges, squeeze the orange juice, and that would be our orange juice for the morning. To have a second glass of orange juice meant that someone had to go out and do that work all over again. And so we learned you never ask for a second glass. Well, of course, by the time we were grown up, we had bottles of orange juice in the fridge, and it was really no problem to get a second glass. And yet that pattern that we had established early on had remained true even as we became adults. Well, that's kind of a silly example, but let's take this a little bit more seriously. Let's think again about one of those big questions of life. What is my reason for being here? Now, as a Christian, you may be willing to say, as one of your statement of beliefs, that in fact, our purpose here, our clear purpose in life, is to glorify and to enjoy God. And yet, when it comes to it, how do I actually live my life? Are my decisions reflecting my goal to glorify and enjoy God? Or do we have a different purpose in mind for why we are here? Again, the Barna Group has done some research. A number of years ago, they interviewed about 2,500 young men and women in what we might call Generation Z or Millennial Group. Take a look at their priorities and remember that these are believing Christians. And look at what their priorities are in life, whether it's to finish their education and start a career or to become financially independent. None of those top three necessarily mean that their main priority in life is actually to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever, although it's possible to do those things while still glorifying God. It's really important that we begin to think clearly about what our true worldview is, and to be honest with ourselves about whether our worldview truly reflects a biblical perspective on life. We must begin to think clearly about how our worldview is going to help us to interpret some of the big areas of life, whether it's science, ethics, politics, philosophy, economics, sociology, theology, history, art, or law. The Christian worldview has something to say about each of these realms, as does every other worldview. As we're going to continue with this series, we're going to try to think a little bit more carefully and purposefully about how we can see Christian worldview reflected in these various areas. As we close, we need to remember that this world's pattern is not necessarily God's pattern. Romans 12 reminds us that we are not to be conformed to the pattern of this world, but that we're to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And as we go through this series, I hope that more and more we'll be thinking clearly about how we can be transformed into God's way of thinking.